All right, today, top 20 failures using a calcium reactor. We failed at all of these things.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, 20 of them.
Yep.
And you can learn from our mistakes so you don't have to experience them for yourself, starting with number one.
Yeah, number one is thinking that this thing is complicated. It looks complicated, I know that, but it actually isn't. It was complicated like 6, 7 years ago when I first got into one. It was all a bunch of switches and bells and levers and stuff, but it's gotten really, really easy.
All right, so now if you can use a pH controller, which is anybody, put a pH probe in here and then just peg the pH inside of here at about 6.5 or 6.7. Now, there's going to be a very controllable amount of alkalinity that's just dripping in your tank. It's pretty consistent, stays the same, and the only thing you need to change now is how much you dose the tank. But instead of like 40 milliliters a day of 2 parts, now 40 milliliters a minute. It's just that easy. So peg the pH and then just control how much you dose, either with a needle valve or even better, a continuous duty dosing pump. But in either case, it is really just that easy. So number two, closely related to that.
Yeah, the mistake is not pegging the pH. So and this is one thing that a mistake that I made, early on when I first got mine, is I wanted to adjust the pH to adjust my alkalinity and things like that. So now I'm playing with flow rates and I'm playing with pH and my pH is constantly toggling off and on for my regulator. It would just made it more complicated. Just peg the pH at a specific number.
So I could actually go on a diatribe about all the other ways to run this and why they were all so complex. But it's all these inverse relationships between flow rate and the amount of CO2, bubbles and drip rates and all this other garbage. It turns out if you just make sure that the pH inside this thing is 6.5 or 6.7 with most medias, done. And then you just figure out how much you're going to dose. So that is absolutely the easiest way to do it. So biggest mistake here is not pegging the pH. All right, number three, this isn't required, but sure makes things easier.
Another mistake I made early on is I tried to start my calcium reactor without a continuous duty dosing pump, and I quickly realized how much of a mistake that was because the effluent tip, gets clogged, and then sometimes it changes the flow rate on you. So I went, before continuous duty dosing pumps were available to the hobbyists, I went on eBay and found a really expensive one. They're not as expensive, and they're well worth it.
Yeah. So here's the thing, is with a continuous duty dosing pump, they're designed to run all the time.
24/7.
Yeah, so a lot of dosing pumps out there, up until a couple years ago, didn't do that.
Like stepper motor type, yeah.
Yeah, they'd wear out pretty fast in a matter of months if you use them that way. The continuous duty dosing pumps, the motors last a long time. You do have to change out the heads and the tubing like anything else. They do wear out.
Adjustable flow rate too on those.
Yeah, but that's just that easy. So I walk up to it and I want to figure out how much I'm going to dose. No more, figuring out the drip rate and adjusting it. It's turning up 40 milliliters a minute. You know what? My alkalinity is starting to drop in the tank. Let's do 45, right? It's going. It's actually going up. Oh, let's do 35. And then before you know it, you honed it in and you don't have to change it anymore. It's that simple. Once you peg the pH and you got a continuous duty dosing pump that will tell you how much you're dosing, it is really that easy. So it does cost a couple $100 usually, but man, does it make it a lot easier. All right, number four. You should at least consider this.
Yeah, the mistake here is not considering your trends of pH in your tank already. You are pumping, 6.5, 6.7 pH effluent fluid into your tank. If you're already struggling with low pH as it is, and you're doing everything you can to try to keep pH up, this might be a consideration for whether or not you use this.
Yeah, so again, if you're already having problems with pH, this might actually lower it 1/10 of a point or two more. Right. But if you're not having problems, it may not actually make any difference. I know in a couple of our tanks you can't even measurably notice it. It really depends on how much carbon dioxide's in your room and how much of this you're actually adding to the tank versus the size of the tank. So if you got a really big tank with a lot of gas exchange and a good skimmer, it probably won't have a big impact. But you should know if you already have a problem, it might make it a little bit worse. Number five, these aren't the cheapest things.
No, and the mistake here is going cheap on your CO2 regulator that attaches to this. And there's a bunch of different ones out there, from all different manufacturers. Some of them are pretty cheap, $20, $30 maybe. And the thing about that is they're not gonna last as long as if you spent the money, and as far as accuracy.
Yeah, this is one of those things that's kind of like the life support for your system. You want it to work. And so we had some cheap ones on the site for a while that ultimately just took off. And now I think the two options are like the Carbon Doser and the Tunes one.
Yep.
Tunes one's high quality and will do what you need to do. I would say a lot of people really, really like the Carbon Doser because you can like actually dial in 2 bubbles a second or whatever. It's really, really, really easy. I wouldn't call that necessary. It was more necessary in an environment where we didn't peg the pH in there. It is a nice backup, but you don't have to spend the money on that Carbon Doser. Something like the Tunes will do as well.
Yeah, and these, the Tunes one and the Carbon Doser, they have the solenoids that are built for this on-off function because you're pegging the pH, and when the pH goes up or down, this thing's gonna be on and off. So it's nice to have a reliable solenoid or regulator with a solenoid that you can trust to do this multiple times a day.
Oh, so if you're hearing this for the first time, actually, that's a really good point. The regulator here will allow small like bubbles of CO2 to come out of the CO2 container here, and the solenoid will just turn it on and off. And that's how the pH controller is going to control the pH inside of here. So combine those two together, they work together best. Number 6, this is one of those mistakes. You're adding all this stuff to your cart, and you really didn't think about this while you're doing it.
Yeah, the mistake is not accounting for the space and the footprint that this is going to take up. So hopefully you have a little bit extra room under your stand, or maybe next to your tank in the fish room. But with a CO2 tank and the reactor itself and a feed pump, this thing can take up a lot of real estate.
So it's kind of deceiving though, because this will actually take up way, way more space than like 2 jugs of 2-part. Right? But it probably has the equivalent of something in the magnitude of several hundred gallons worth of 2-part in terms of media inside here. So you don't have to change it out anywhere near as often. So instead of having really large vessels or vessels that got changed out frequently, it takes up more space, but it also has way, way, way more capacity. Number 7, there's always a downside.
Yeah, so the mistake here is not considering phosphate, especially with these medias that are limestone or old coral skeleton, calcium carbonate type stuff. These do have phosphate in them, and they will put phosphate in your tank.
We're trying to find a media that doesn't have phosphate, but these actually look like actual coral, right?
Bits,
Every living creature is going to have phosphate bound up in its coral skeleton, and so when we melt it, everything goes into the tank. So there's some trace elements we found, like strontium and other things in here actually get dosed to the tank as well. But there's also phosphate in here. So note that when you're using a lot of calcium reactor medias, that it is a source of phosphate for your tank, and you might need to compensate for that with like GFO or a new solution. Number 8, there is a difference between the various medias.
Yeah, and that size is the mistake here of not considering, and that is, we've got some media like these coral bits that are pretty large, and then you have some other ones, that come in small, medium, and large sizes. Small sizes are probably going to melt a little faster than the larger ones.
So basically it's about surface area. So if I had a whole liter full of really big rocks, there's limited surface area. However, if I had a liter full of almost like sand, it's a tremendous amount of surface area. So it actually exposes it and melts a little bit faster. However, clogs a lot faster as well.
The small stuff,
In most cases, I would tell people get as large as you can because it doesn't clog and it requires less maintenance, and I'm okay with the fact that I need to use a little bit more media and a slightly larger reactor to reduce the maintenance requirements. But there's some other differences here too that you should note. There's some things that look like they're made out of calcite instead of calcium carbonate. They're still both calcium carbonate, but the calcite dissolves at like a lower pH. You can see it's almost like marbly. Some of them probably are mined material, maybe not this coral, and maybe it has a little less phosphate in it. We'll probably see that in some of our BRSTV Investigates in the future, actually. So, I don't know, but just note that the different medias do have different attributes to them, and smaller is definitely different than large. So, number 9, I've often been told size is more about contact time, but I think it's about something else.
Yeah, and that's a mistake, is not considering the size, and you kind of look at these ratings. Some of these have ratings on them on how many gallons of tank it's going to work for, but in the end, the larger you can get, the more happier you'll be.
Probably. It's been my experience that whether or not this thing is full or half full at most flow rates that most people would use, it's actually the same concentration of alkalinity in the effluent it doesn't matter how big it is full. So like the size of the reactor doesn't, in contact time, really not the primary thing here for me. For me, it's how often do I need to change out the media, right? And how much does it hold? And so for you, you can decide that, but I would just say, in general, the bigger ones will actually allow you to maintenance it less and probably worth the money. And if you look at the total cost of all of the stuff when you buy it, it's really not that much. And then the whole thing scales with you to the next tank as well. Number 10, does all this stuff add trace elements?
That's the mistake is, thinking or depending on your calcium reactor to add trace elements back in. We did some ICP tests on some of the media, but if you think about it, where is most of the trace elements in like coral bits, where is it harbored? And not all of it's in the skeleton.
Yeah, in fact, we kind of found the opposite was true.
Right.
And it does add some trace elements, like I mentioned, strontium, and things that get bound up in the skeletal structure. But the coral's really two things. First, or actually three things. It's also the protein-based tissue, as well as the zooxanthellae that lives within it. Turns out a lot of those trace elements, like molybdenum and all those other things, are actually regulating photosynthesis. And they're inside of the coral's tissue, as well as the zooxanthellae or algae within the tissue. And so when it dies and it doesn't have that tissue anymore, it's not in here. So I personally really don't believe that this is a large portion of trace elements, and I had to adjust for that in a different method or additive system to complement the reactor. Number 11, I bet you a lot of people don't do this.
Yeah, and it was really eye-opening. And the mistake here is not testing the strength or concentration of your effluent. You can find out what your tank is used to, like 35 DKH or 40 DKH, just by testing the effluent. And you can do that, even like we do it with a Hanna checker, where you just dilute the sample. So the Hanna checker only goes to 20 parts, or only reads as high as 20 parts per million. So I do half sample and half DI water, and now I can multiply the result by 2 and find out if I'm at 40 DKH or 35 DKH.
So that's a good kind of window into how this works as well, because your tank right now might be like 8 DKH, right? And the tank water is pumped into this thing. It's cycled with the CO2 and the media in here. And then it comes out of the reactor often around 30 to 40 DKH, right? And so you'll know just by testing that DKH. Have it go into a little cup and just test it. And you'll know the strength. And essentially this becomes your one-part machine, adding both calcium and alkalinity in equal amounts. And you know the strength by testing that reactor. Again, as long as you peg the pH, it should be pretty darn stable. Number 12, sometimes things are better together.
Yeah, and in this case, it's Kalkwasser and the calcium reactor combo. So don't overlook that or make the mistake of not considering Kalkwasser on yours, especially if you're struggling with that pH issue. Kalkwasser adds pH and adds calcium and alkalinity, which can really complement this calcium reactor.
So there's really 3 reasons to that, and I will say it's super, super, super common, like you said, to have these things mixed together. And one of them is because Kalkwasser is so cheap. It's one of the cheapest ways to add calcium and alkalinity in a single solution to the tank. Complements this really well. But there's 2 reasons why it actually helps with the pH. One is because the Kalkwasser does help with the pH if you put it in your auto top-off solution or if you just dose it directly into the tank with a dosing pump. But also is because you're lowering the demand of calcium alkalinity in the tank by using a bunch of Kalkwasser. You've already added a bunch, which means you don't have to work the calcium reactor as hard. You're going to add less of that low pH effluent to the tank, and so together raise the pH together, and it often works better than they do separately. Number 13, I actually thought this was true until somebody pointed out I was wrong.
Yeah, the mistake is thinking that this has to run 24/7, and if you think about it, if I'm pegging the pH in here, I don't necessarily need to run water through it or run a pump through it all the time. I might be able to just scale back how often I dose it because this is a known concentration, it's a known pH, and on demand, if I need 50 mils in an hour, turn on my pump for 50 mils during that hour.
Yeah, so you can use a higher velocity pump, I guess, is part of the thing.
Yeah.
So instead of doing 50 milliliters a minute, I could do 1,000 milliliters a minute and just have it on like much less time.
Yeah.
As long as the reactor is big enough to still provide the contact time for that, but most of them probably will be. You could also choose to have it 100 milliliters a minute, but only on during the day when the lights are consuming all of the carbon dioxide, so it has very little effect on the pH instead of lowering it at night. So note that it doesn't have to be on all the time. You just have to have a certain dose a day, and you can split it up really any way you like. Number 14, don't be lazy.
Which means calibrate your pumps. So don't overlook calibrating them. Do it like once a quarter or something, 4 times a year. But make sure that you're getting the stability from your calcium reactor that your tank needs by having an accurate dose every time.
That could be your continuous duty dosing pump, making sure when it says 100 milliliters, it's actually doing 100. And I know all of us would like to just set it and forget it, but honestly, everything needs to be calibrated. Everything needs to be checked on once in a while. Even the little effluent valve over here too. You know, once in a while, just go, you tuned it to 100 milliliters a minute, go check it every now and then and make sure something didn't clog it, because it is important, because it actually changes how much calcium alkalinity you're going to add to the tank. So don't be lazy, calibrate, or actually calibrate your valve or your dosing pump. Number 15, sometimes we wait for things to break before we change them, and sometimes that's just not a good idea.
So the mistake here is maintenance and changing those moving parts. So you have a recirculating pump that probably needs maintenance a couple times a year, a regulator that you should probably take a look at, but really in that continuous duty dosing pump, you have a tube that's being pinched a bunch of times every single day. That's going to wear down and lose its elasticity. And also the motor head on your continuous duty dosing pump. They're not made to last forever, so swap them out.
Yeah, so the little rollers and stuff, any moving part eventually will fail, right? So, you know, really anything on the tank, decide if this failed, how long would it take for me to notice? And if it did, how big of a deal would it be? If the answer is it would take me a really long time and it would be a really big deal, then replace it beforehand. So, like the dosing pump's tubing in many cases is only a few bucks. Change the thing out every 6 months or even year. Don't wait for it to fail. And when it does fail for you the first time, well, now you know, hey, that took about 9 months. Let's do it in 8 next time. You know, and you can just, you know, preempt that whole thing. And note that every part on this thing that is moving is actually going to wear out. So, you know, make sure that you're just maintaining it like the pumps, and take out the impeller and clean it, and it will work for you in the long run. Number 16, sometimes it can be noisy, and there's a couple cool tricks.
Yeah, the mistake is not considering a needle valve on the recirculating part of the skimmer. So this thing is recirculating all kinds of water, and it's also recirculating air that's trapped inside, maybe even that CO2 bubbles that come in there. There's a pocket, a gap of CO2 or air, and those bubbles make noise.
Yeah, so it's super common for, I mean, I think every design I've seen allows you to recirculate the air. So the CO2 will collect to the top, and then just sucks it back in the pump and cycles it through. And in many cases, it will run pretty silently, but sometimes there's just too much air, and you start hearing the kind of a surging noise. And one of the cool tips that you can use to fix for that is use a needle valve, or maybe even like a ball valve, put it on that line, and now you can kind of tune how much air it's sucking off the top. And you're not really tuning anything other than, I want to make sure that there's still air going in there so it doesn't just build up, but only so much that I don't hear it. And so add a little valve on there and you can actually silence the whole thing. 17 is probably pretty common.
Yeah, the mistake is putting it somewhere where you cannot maintenance it. I mean, when it comes time to add more media or swap out media or pull out pumps or pull out the whole thing to maintenance it, you know, don't get it buried in the back of your stand somewhere, deep in the corner where you can't, it's such a hard time getting it out. Put it somewhere where you can pull it out.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have to refill it with media. You're going to have to get new CO2, and it's just really hard if you bury it way back in there. So make sure it's accessible, and you'll be happy in the long run. Number 18, this is a total miss.
Yeah, so the same thing with the pH issues with the calcium reactor. If you have a refugium, don't make the mistake of not feeding it into the refugium. The thing is on at night when your pH is naturally low anyway. So if your refugium is helping with your pH at night, then why not dose the CO2 low pH effluent into that?
Yeah, that goes for a CO2 scrubber or an algae reactor, anything that's using photosynthesis that will uptake the excess CO2. So also, that kind of ties into one of the things we said earlier, where maybe you could only run your calcium reactor at night as well, you know, and you know, these are tools that can be tuned to a specific need. Number 19, you can actually supplement this calcium media with other stuff.
Yeah, so the mistake is not considering magnesium media for this. I mean, this is calcium carbonate, so you're getting alkalinity and calcium out of it, but sometimes we forget about magnesium.
there'll be a little bit of magnesium often bound up in this, but it's often not enough.
Right.
So they make media like dolomite that you can mix in with it, and it will dissolve and add magnesium as well. I will say that it sometimes needs to be tuned down the pH just a little further to get it to melt properly. But mixing this media with the dolomite or the magnesium media actually makes it so this is adding magnesium to your tank as well. Number 20, if you have a refugium or like a fish room, this will probably be a problem.
Yeah, and this is a mistake we've made here on the 160, is this thing is mounted in the light, exposed to all the light multiple hours a day, starts to grow stuff in there.
Yeah, it's got CO2, it's got nutrients, it's got everything needs to grow anything. So you might see some algae film start to grow on the sides of the container if you have light. So you can either try to turn the light off in the room or put it in a place there's no light, or you could wrap it.
Yeah.
So find something like
Easy on, easy off.
black piece of plastic that you could wrap it in, and then you could prevent the algae growth as well. All right, so if there's only one thing you heard today, let it be this.
Yeah, for me, it is do not overlook Kalkwasser with your calcium reactor. It's going to help you with your pH. It's going to take less demand on your calcium reactor, and it's cheap.
Yeah. The other thing for me is actually that it's hard to say this out loud, but I think it's probably true that in the long run, something like this is actually easier than two-part because you have way less maintenance. That this container of media might last most of the year for many people, and you have way less jugs to fill up once you understand how to do it. And it's really just the pH that you have to peg and figure out how much to dose from there. And if this is interesting to you and you're thinking about doing it, we have a Master Your
yeah.
Calcium Reactor playlist, and you can see it right here.